At 9:40 in the morning, a city of stone churches, harbor cranes, and crowded streets began to move like water. Before the disaster, Lisbon looked like a city at the center of the world. Ships from Africa, Brazil, and Asia crowded the river. Church bells marked the morning. Merchants moved through narrow streets packed with stone houses, warehouses, and monasteries. Portugal had grown rich from overseas trade, and the capital showed that wealth in palaces, gold leaf, and busy docks. Yet the city also carried hidden danger. Many buildings were tall, dense, and close together. The streets were tight, and the waterfront was full of fragile wooden structures. Lisbon's beauty was real, but so was its vulnerability. On November 1st, 1755, the earthquake struck during All Saints' Day, when many people were in churches for Mass. The ground rolled so violently that buildings seemed to sway and split apart. Vaults collapsed. Towers cracked. People outside saw dust rising across the city in great waves. The shock was not a quick jolt. It came in repeated convulsions that made the whole landscape feel unstable. Witnesses wrote about terror, confusion, and a strange silence that sometimes followed the strongest shaking. Within minutes, familiar streets had become piles of stone, timber, and broken ritual objects scattered across sacred ground. The disaster exposed a brutal truth about the city's strongest symbols. Churches, the buildings meant to feel eternal, were among the first to fail. Heavy masonry roofs fell inward. Altars vanished under dust. Candles toppled into piles of cloth and wood. The timing made the damage even worse because so many worshippers were inside when the quake hit. People who escaped the falling buildings ran into streets that were already unsafe. Every doorway looked like a possible trap. Every wall seemed ready to crack. Lisbon did not simply suffer structural damage. It suffered the collapse of trust in the ground, the walls, and the institutions that had seemed permanent. After the shaking, the sea gave the city its next warning. In the harbor, the water pulled back in an unnatural way, exposing the riverbed and alarming those who recognized the danger. Then the tsunami arrived. Huge waves surged into the waterfront, smashing ships against piers and sweeping through low-lying districts. The retreat and return of the water made the catastrophe feel almost biblical, but it was a physical chain of events triggered by the earthquake offshore. Lisbon's connection to the Atlantic, once the source of its wealth, became the path through which destruction rushed back into the city. The earthquake and the wave were only the beginning. Fires broke out across the ruined city, fed by overturned candles, damaged kitchens, collapsed chimneys, and stores of timber. Because buildings had already been weakened, firefighters and survivors could do little to stop the flames once they spread. The fire turned neighborhoods into furnaces and erased what the quake had spared. In a single day, Lisbon was hit by 3 different disasters: shaking, flooding, and fire. That sequence matters. Each stage made the next one worse, and together they transformed a major European capital into a landscape of smoke, heat, and near-total confusion. Survivors faced choices no one should have to make. Some fled toward the hills. Others searched for family members in the ruins. Some tried to rescue the trapped, while others feared aftershocks and ran without looking back. The city filled with cries, smoke, and the sound of collapsing masonry. Social order did not disappear completely, but it was badly strained. Food, water, and shelter all became urgent needs at once. In a catastrophe like this, survival depends not just on courage but on information. People needed to know where safe ground might be, whether more waves were coming, and whether the city itself was still livable. Portugal's ruling family escaped the worst of the destruction by moving away from the city center and later remaining outside Lisbon. The king's survival mattered politically because it kept the state functioning, but it also changed the emotional center of the crisis. A capital without a secure royal presence can drift into rumor and fear. Officials had to act quickly to restore order, protect supply lines, and decide how to manage the dead, the wounded, and the homeless. Even in the middle of disaster, leadership was not abstract. It was a matter of organizing bread, water, guards, and communication while the ground still felt untrustworthy. The most important figure in the response was Sebastio Jose de Carvalho y Melo, later the Marquis of Pombal. He became the face of recovery because he asked practical questions immediately. How many dead? Where are the supplies? Who is in charge of rescue? And what can be stabilized first? His famous response was blunt in spirit, even when the exact wording varies in later retellings. Bury the dead and feed the living was the governing logic. That approach sounds simple, but it marked a new kind of state power. Less ceremonial, more administrative, and focused on survival before symbolism. Exact death counts are difficult because the disaster scattered bodies, destroyed records, and drew people from surrounding regions into the city. Historians usually speak in the tens of thousands rather than a single precise number. That uncertainty does not make the event less real. It shows how complete the disruption was. The earthquake struck not only buildings, but the systems that preserve knowledge. Parish records, property lists, and normal civic routines were all damaged. In that sense, the catastrophe erased more than architecture. It damaged the city's memory, making later reconstruction also a work of historical recovery. The rebuilding of Lisbon became one of the most ambitious urban projects of the 18th century. Rather than simply patching the old city, planners redesigned key districts with straighter streets, broader avenues, and more rational layouts. The downtown center, later known as the Baixa, was rebuilt with standardized facades and open squares that made movement and oversight easier. This was not just architecture. It was a political decision about how a capital should function after catastrophe. The new city would be easier to govern, easier to move through, and harder to trap in the same medieval congestion that had helped the original disaster spread so fast. The reconstruction also changed how buildings were made. Engineers used a system often associated with the Pombaline style, including internal wooden frameworks designed to improve resistance to shaking. This was an early example of learning from disaster through design. Builders were no longer just restoring what had existed before. They were testing whether a city could be made less fragile by changing its bones. The result was not indestructibility. It was caution made visible in architecture. The city remembered the earthquake every time it repaired streets, facades, and grids repeated the lesson that survival sometimes depends on redesigning the ordinary. The Lisbon earthquake became famous far beyond Portugal because it forced Europeans to think about disaster in a new way. Philosophers, theologians, and writers tried to explain how such suffering could happen on a holy day in a major capital. The event did not just destroy property. It challenged assumptions about providence, order, and the stability of the world. In later debates, Lisbon became a reference point for modern thinking about earthquakes, suffering, and human vulnerability. The city's catastrophe, therefore, traveled outward as an idea. People who never saw the ruins still argued about what the ruins meant. Today, Lisbon is not remembered only for what was lost. It is remembered for how it was rebuilt and how the rebuilt city still carries the trace of 1755. The wide streets of Baixa, the reconstructed squares, and the later interpretations of the disaster all preserve that memory in different forms. The earthquake is part of the city's identity, but not as a frozen wound. It is a turning point. Lisbon became a place where destruction led to design, and design became a public memory of disaster. That is what makes the story endure, not just the shaking, but the response that followed. The earthquake changed more than one city. It changed how leaders thought about emergency response, how engineers thought about safer construction, and how writers thought about human vulnerability. Lisbon's story is powerful because it combines catastrophe with recovery. The disaster was not absorbed by time and forgotten. It reshaped the capital, influenced debate across Europe, and left a city where history is visible in the street plan itself. In the end, Lisbon teaches a hard lesson. A city can be broken in a morning, but if it survives, it can also be remade into something that remembers the break. The final image is not just ruins or smoke. It is a blueprint. Lisbon's disaster became a lesson for future cities. Do not only ask how to survive the first blow. Ask how to organize rescue, how to rebuild streets, how to strengthen structures, and how to preserve memory after the crisis. That is why 1755 still matters. It is not merely an old earthquake story. It is a case study in collapse, leadership, engineering, and adaptation. The city that fell became the city that taught others how to stand again.